Welcome to Byte the Future podcasts. Byte the Future is a podcast channel from Jenrick, dedicated to how technology is influencing our lives today and tomorrow. In this episode, we have the privilege of interviewing Christine Ashton, SAP's Global CDO in the Digital Office, ERP Cloud. Christine has consistently held executive-level global CIO, CTO, SVP digital roles, delivering strategic transformation to simplify and diverse major companies. She has also had the extensive NED and advisory board experience and is currently an INED for NPSO, overseeing the delivery of an innovative new payments architecture to support the growing UK economy. Prior to her role, she was a Global SVP Technology at Thomson Reuters and held key positions at BP, ultimately Chief Information Manager, running some of the world's largest business processes and technology infrastructures and creating some industry firsts, such as the first ever carbon trade. Christine is consistently ranked in the Chief Information Officer CIO 100 and amongst the top 50 most influential women in UK information technology. She is a leader experienced at creating a positive cultural environment to support sustainable, innovative, at scale as a platform to deliver resilient strategic growth. You can also download this podcast from iTunes and follow our channel for further podcasts. Here is Christine chatting to our very own Jenrick IT Managing Director, Philip Fantham.
Thank you, Christine. Thanks for firstly agreeing to record this podcast with us, but also for agreeing to be a guest speaker at Byte the Future Live on June the 7th. Very much looking forward to that. Some of the things we want to discuss today are leadership, the future of, the challenges and disruption that we're facing in the near future, and maybe a little bit further out as well. So I suppose the first question thinking about that is, how do you think leadership will change within maybe the next 5 to 10 years?
Everybody always says in IT, like the next set of changes are 10 years away, because people often really don't like to predict very short term. And, one of the things I think we've got to start doing with IT and tech is to start predicting really short term. And I think if you look historically at how IT's been managed, it's tended to be managed very siloed, in a siloed way. And a lot of companies have tended to follow the stack model is what I always call it, of how you even structure IT. So, you'd have the database team, the networks team, and all the rest of it. And I think what's happening is, as technology is changing and getting better, and you're getting more things that are automated, it's automating IT as well. So I think that, just over the next few years, we're going to see rapid changes, because a lot of our work we used to do, database administrators, network analysts, all of these types of things, those sorts of jobs at the real execution level, I don't think will exist. A lot of them don't exist now, but I think, they really won't exist. Definitely in 10 years' time, but even in the next couple, And, I think what we've got to probably work hard at as IT management, tech managers, is really working out what are the skills adjacencies that we need to be thinking about, how we have people with those sorts of skills planning for and moving into over the next couple of years, And I think it's going to be really key that we actually start to stand back from what we're doing in IT and start to take much more of a system view of the world, not system view of the world, and actually starting to be much more predictive about the services that we're delivering. And, increasingly companies and lines of business are just buying software as a service or anything because of the service on. Well, it used to be credit cards, I'm sure it's not now. But, they are buying it. So we have to sort of say, well, what does that mean about how IT adds value over the next few years? And I think if you were to think, 10 years out, because thinking further out always gives you an insight into what it would be like just in 3 years' time. But I think 10 years' time, then, IT has got to really be thinking about how do we plan for the next disruption, because at the moment we think about disruptions on a timeline of maybe 3 to 5 years and by industry, but I kind of think in 10 years' time that will just be the way life is. Things are disrupted every day, things are changing all the time, and if you're living in that sort of world, then what does your IT become and what does it look like? And what are the things that you really need to worry about and which ones don't you? And, people talk about autonomousness. And if we pick on the cars just for a minute, If I told you just to do a trial of autonomous cars, you're looking at having 8 to 12 petabytes of data available in real time, in the moment. Then you kind of say to yourself, well, what does that say about what we need to be doing, thinking and planning in IT, if that's the trajectory?
When you talk about next disruption, what kind of things would you be thinking about?
Well, I'll give you an example. And if I look at the way companies are thinking about just managing their assets these days, historically, people have gone and visited the assets. When I worked in the water industry, it was a day out going visiting all the service reservoirs and doing interesting things. But now, if we can technologically equip these assets to start looking after themselves and think about their own condition monitoring and all of that sort of stuff, and if we can now start to have these assets be able to detect their own faults, and if they're super clever, and they can know exactly what sort of fault it is and who to call, so if it's electrical fault or if it's a capacity fault or if it's just a complete breakdown fault, they know what type of engineers to call out. So if you had a pump or some sort of kit somewhere, and it could know, right, this is the type of engineer I need to call out. Or if you had something like a large, we were talking earlier about the retail sector, freezers, freezers that supply big supermarkets. And if those types of assets could calculate what's the loss I'm going to suffer as a result of being out. If it's food, I can work out how much food's going to be spoiled. I can work out not only how much food's going to be spoiled, but maybe I can also work out, are there some customers close by that actually, rather than the food be spoiled, we could send it to them, or a food bank or a charity or a hospital or whatever. And while the engineer's coming and fixing these assets, be it a pump or a freezer or whatever, the asset can work out what time it's going to be back in service. It can also work out, potentially, have I been fixed and am I happy with that fix? And then, if that wasn't all good enough, it could authorise the payment of the bill. So, the bill to fix it is, £500. And instead of the bill going to a human, the bill goes to the freezer and says to the freezer or the pump, are you happy for us to pay this bill? And it says, yeah, I'm in production. This is how much was wasted. This is how much value I've been able to salvage, and I'm fully up to spec. And suddenly, the bill gets paid. It orders its own preventative maintenance, and I think that's kind of the world we're going into. And a lot of people will start to say, well, crumbs, that won't work because not everywhere's got broadband. But I think one of the things that you're starting to see a lot of it is edge compute, and you're starting to see a lot of devices now that actually work in a different way and can form some sort of local grid amongst themselves. And then you start to say to yourself that rather than the way we've traditionally thought about things, we were talking earlier about always thinking about data coming back to the centre. I think we're entering into a world where, a lot of data will just be kept at the edge, used once and maybe thrown away, or summarised and then sent into the centre. So I think the way we think about assets, what they can do for themselves and what they can't, will change. I think the way we think about how humans interact with those assets will change. And then I think the way we think about data and the way it flows across an organisation and who can have access to it is going to change dramatically. And I don't think that's 10 years. I think it's probably literally the next few, really.
And in terms of equipping organisations for this, one of the topics you're going to talk about at Byte the Future is lateral leadership. Could you just tell us a little bit more? What is lateral leadership?
So, if you think about years ago when communications technology or whatever was probably quite expensive, then the only most efficient way to communicate to people was to get them together in groups and do the hierarchical top-down. Now we've got all the social media and all sorts of things have changed. So now you're no longer reliant on hierarchy for the things that we used to be. So we were very reliant on it for distributing things, for, like I just said, telling people messages. So very top-down approach. And we're also reliant on hierarchy for making sure people were done things the way they were supposed to do it, or ways of doing things were passed on. So that's all kind of changed. And, the young people in the workforce, I'd literally only been at SAP for a couple of weeks, and, I was busily sat at my desk and thinking, what could I get on with doing? And I said to one of the younger members of staff, could you do this job for me? And this person immediately turned around to me and said, basically she said, can't you Google it? What she really meant was, can't you do it yourself? But what she meant was really, really interesting, because what she meant was, why can't you Google SAP as though it was the internet and find that data in SAP the way you would if you were Googling the internet? So it was actually quite an interesting comment when you thought about it, because the challenge we have in a lot of companies is everything is so siloed, and the only way to deal with that silo is to have all these hierarchies. So you say, well, in modern business, then if you assume that data flows across the organisation, it flows sideways as well as horizontally as well as vertically, then you say, well, what is the hierarchy really doing for you? So lateral leadership is really about, well, how can we as leaders really encourage people to work better, do smarter things, do things often they would never have really done, in a way that they feel more autonomous, they feel more empowered. And I think the thing you find with the younger generation coming into the workforce, and we have a lot of people that fall into that category at SAP, is they want to have a degree of transparency to be able to see where what they're doing matches to where the company's going. So they want to see, well, how does what I'm doing translate into P&L, EBITDA, customers, viability, all of those things. So I think that hierarchy probably has never done that as well as we all would have liked, and I think we've got to really work harder at joining a company up horizontally and helping staff to stand back a bit from that and creating this more system view of the company. And in a recent survey, some leaders were polled about what did they think about this idea of lateral leadership and what did they think about going cross-boundary in an organisation. And they said, well, yeah, that's really what we should be doing. And a lot of people said, well, if you work for an international company, you kind of have to do it. But 86% of them said they didn't know how to do it, and they didn't feel that they could do it effectively, and they didn't think they could do it effectively enough. So there's a gap, obviously a gap there. I think the other thing that's really interesting, and we talk a lot about AI and machine learning, and people sort of talk about them being sort of bad things occasionally. But if you start to think about how companies probably need to operate, and it's probably much more the way social media works and much more of a network and a connected entity, then you start to say, well, if you look at the jobs people are doing today, there's quite a lot of data on this, but if you sort of summarise the data, it tends to say that 55 to 58% of what people do are maintenance tasks in most roles. 15% are continuous learning and improvement, and about 8% are about learning and teaching themselves to do more things. Now, if you compare that with how the younger generation think, we need to be flipping it on its head, because the younger generation, they're probably more inclined to be, I'm just making a guess now, but it's probably more like 40% more learning and 40% can I do something better, and then 20% maintenance. And, it also pays into what we were saying about IT and how IT is managed. If you look at all the surveys by Gartner, for example, IT directors and CIOs will tell you they probably spend 80% of the budget on maintenance. So something has to change, and I think thinking more laterally and starting to change the way we regard working companies and really making this shift to spending much more time on continuous improvement and much more time on acquiring new skills, I think it is what's going to make a huge difference. And I think that if companies don't start to think more laterally and behave more laterally and manage more laterally, where they're releasing people from departments to go experiment or go learn and try to do something and see how quickly it fails, then I don't see how companies will develop these new muscles to compete in this new disrupted world, really. Because, as we were saying before, learning how to do business in a different way, maybe learning how to do business when you've always been a B2B company, learning how to do it B to the customer, learning how to work in a marketplace and work with an ecosystem of providers. So, unless we start to think more laterally, think more collaboratively, and think more like a business network, then it's not really clear to me how companies will compete.
And in terms of the lateral leadership and in terms of next generation post-disruption in business, do you think AI and machine learning can help us, or how will it affect how we run and lead our businesses?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that AI and machine learning can totally help us. Because if you take that assumption, just for argument's sake, that maybe as much as, say, 70% of somebody's job could be maintenance. And say, for argument's sake, we're in the finance function. And, you know, what we see, certainly at SAP, is a lot of companies, it's the finance function that's starting to lead this challenge towards zero-touch finance, for example, zero-touch maintenance of a function. So if you imagine a lot of the finance could just get done, and, you know, machine learning and artificial intelligence, particularly machine learning and robotic process automation, could really help these departments to match invoices, to look at how quickly we've paid people, who we haven't paid people, who has bought faster than they thought they were going to buy out of our customers, and can we actually start to match supply to their demand a bit better. Then suddenly your own staff can be in a very different place. They can be starting to think about not just trends in the industry where you are, but maybe looking at, well, what's the next level of disruption going to be in our industry, and what impact will it have on our margins, and therefore what impact will it have on our profits? So suddenly I think you're really switching your people's efforts and reallocating them to these activities that are more towards not innovation in the sense of we've just we've just invented the wheel or whatever, but it's more about innovation in your industry, if that industry is going to be really disrupted, and innovation in terms of, well, how can you work differently, who could you partner with differently, how could you come up with a couple of strategies that would mean your margin is going to stay the same or get better, but maybe based on the way you do business in a different way. So maybe instead of selling products, now you're going to sell services, and you're going to charge for the time that somebody uses your services, rather than people just take out, an annual license, for example.
So you think AI and machine learning particularly will remove or greatly minimise the amount of those maintenance area tasks for people, to allow them to free them up to think more creatively, perhaps? Yeah,
more creatively, but more analytically as well, because they'll have the time to spend much more time on the analytics of their industry and how they compare with their peers. But the thing I think that machine learning and robotic process automation will give us is the resilience and the reliability, because I think that that's something, if you're an industry that's delivering, people are buying from online and people are delivering to, then you kind of want reliability. You want the right thing to go out to the right customer on the right day. And I think if machine learning can help with that predictability and help us to better match supply and demand, then I think a lot of companies would certainly pay for that. But, a lot of companies could access different and better sources of value, if that was the case.
Fantastic. The next generation of leaders, and in fact in the lateral world across the organisation, how do you think people are going to cope with data overload? Because it's one of those things that's frequently talked about, that there's going to be so much information, it's hard to know what to do with it. So
yeah, it is, isn't it? And I think we all just get that in our own lives. Never mind in the workplace. So I kind of think there's a couple of things. I think some of the themes that we've talked about will help that. So think about it, machine learning and this ability to summarise in a different way and to take some of the processing out of the system and simplify are going to help some of that. I think the other thing is that we need to change the way we manage, and I think that the newer, let's call them the new lateral leaders, they're going to be more interested in managing by exception. And I think as leaders we probably need to be thinking more about how do we help ourselves to probably trust more, because we've all been there. I don't trust that somebody will have done this, or I don't trust that this will have happened, so therefore I better check it. But I think in the new land we're probably thinking more about managing by exception, managing by much better and much more real-time performance statistics and things like that.
Can I just ask, managing by exception, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think just managing the things that haven't gone well, or managing the things that maybe you thought that all your parcels went out the previous day, but you just focus on the 3 that didn't, or the customers that all reordered, just why did the 3 that didn't? So it's just moving to that type of thinking. And, I think that that's going to be really interesting. I also think the other thing that people of the future, like the next few years, will be doing is really thinking about ecosystems in a different way, marketplaces and ecosystems in a different way. So, for example, we've always thought of businesses as being much more centralised, so you get lots and lots of data. But actually, if you start to think of businesses as being much more decentralised, and actually you're doing business with more partners and they're doing business on your behalf, the way Amazon does, and maybe think about data as being summarised at every level, then kind of the data and information overload sort of starts to take care of itself, I think. I think it starts to adjust back to the right level that it's supposed to be at. And I think it also changes the way we think about things, in that we always thought systems had to be centralised, and we always thought data should be all in one big database. My view is that things need to exist at the level where they add the most value at, and then either deleted or summarised and just, something maybe to support an audit trail sent to the next level. And I think that's the way we'll start to structure businesses in a very different way.
So, if you were to give advice to CXOs, how to harness a more open, transparent, lateral enterprise world, what would your advice be? I'm thinking not only the leaders of today, but the next future generation of leaders, the millennials or Generation Ys or whoever these people, whoever they happen to be. What sort of advice would you give them?
So I think there's a couple of things to think of. One of them I think that's going to be really important is to be really, really clear about the things in your business that you keep close and you might keep local, and the things that actually you're happy to either be done away from where you are or to just be done and you never hear about them other than by exception, and just get really clear about that. Because I think what that enables you to do is sort of liberates you in a way, because if you can be clear about that, you can also be clear about the data you need close and the data you can have sort of more remote, and the same with the systems. And I think, the thing that it then starts to open up is, well, actually, maybe I don't need to maintain my own systems to do X, Y, Z anymore. Maybe it is okay for me to just buy them in as a service. And if you take that to the next level, it's also about being clear about not only which things you can keep close and not so close, but also which things can you standardise and commoditise. So which things is it good enough to do the same as everybody else versus which things do you need to differentiate yourself? And I think getting really clear about that is really key, because I think if you get clear about that, then, like I say, your systems, data, people, processes, you can start to think of them like that. And I think the thing that it then does is you don't have to close the company to do big upgrade projects anymore, because if you start clear from the outset with that, then you can organise your company so that it scales. I think the other thing I would say to people is, don't fall into the mindset that, every time your business changes, we have to do big projects or close the company down for 2 years where we do a rollout or whatever. I think it's about engineering so that you can have elastic scale and, buy the things you need to as a service, so that you're never stuck in terms of running out of capacity or all the rest of it. I think the other thing is some of the things we just talked about. I think we've really got to change the way we think about career learning, and it's not just a course. And I think we've really got to change the way we think about how much time people spend learning and what learning is. And I think, we've got to think about learning probably much more about shadowing, doing different jobs, learning from an activity that went well or not so well, and upping the percentage, because if, for argument's sake, people are only perhaps spending 8 to 10% of their time learning, then I think in the world we're heading to, it's got to be a lot more. We've got to find some other things to think about. And I think the other thing I'd say to CXOs is really start to surround yourself and put together what I call guiding coalitions, some advisory boards. And on the things that you think maybe traditionally you shouldn't have. So why not put together an advisory board for your company on security? Or why not put together, one on the disruptions in my industry, and get some people in to talk about it, and also talk to people about, well, how do I make my company not just more reliable, but how do I make my company so that it can recover better, faster, quicker from downtime or outages. Because that's what the smart companies are doing. And the other thing the smart companies are doing is they're going through that cycle all the time. So they're going through this cycle of thinking about learning, thinking about margins, thinking about how they divide what's normal for the company versus what's differentiated. And they don't just do that every 6 months or every decade, how we used to do with business process engineering. They're doing it all the time. They're doing it every 12 weeks. And they're basically thinking, well, we commoditized that. Could we commoditize something else? Or could we differentiated that and we got some customers and we grew a bit? Well, what would happen if we differentiated ourselves in other areas? And that's what they're doing really. And then really having processes that incorporate all these learnings as well as the things that fail back into the way their business runs on a continuous basis. So I think the CXOs of the future, it's, really thinking about, all of those things, learning about how you differentiate yourselves, what things could you do just as good as anybody else, what things should you keep close to yourself versus far. Those are the sort of things I'd talk to them about.
That is brilliant. Christine, it's been an absolute delight talking to you today. I really appreciate you giving us some time. Very much looking forward to your live performance at Byte the Future 2018. But for now, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thanks, Christine, and thank you for listening to Jenrick's Byte the Future podcasts. We have a great selection of guests coming up on Jenrick's Byte the Future podcast, so keep an eye out for those on www.jenrick.co.uk.